And is there a mic to pass around? Yeah, so a mic there. Yeah.
Thank you. My name's Katie. I work with BRAC, and I have some questions from our TUP team, or one question from our TUP team. We have a Targeting the Ultra Poor program in Bangladesh, working with 1.6 million people so far to get them out of ultra poverty. And the question is, from our perspective, it's quite difficult for governments, CBOs, NGOs, or donors to influence extreme poverty on their own. I wondered if you knew of any mechanisms by which, supporting mechanisms whereby people and organisations can work together, either internally in individual contexts. Andrea, you mentioned in Ecuador's case the kind of interplay between CBOs and the government. I wondered in Ethiopia if there was any CBO, NGO influence in those policies, and also maybe globally, if that's not too ambitious.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Helen Dennis. I work at Christian Aid. A lot of the work that we've been doing with partners globally has very much focused on those communities that have historically been discriminated against and therefore lack access to services as a result of discrimination, stigma. And I didn't hear much about the need to really tackle those head on. I didn't know whether or not within the case studies that have been presented, in some respects, geography was a proxy for kind of focusing on the kind of hard issues around discrimination, ethnic minorities, caste, etc. And then secondly, I didn't really hear much gendered analysis. And I was interested to hear whether there are particular strategies that have been successful in involving women in pro-poor growth. Thanks.
Take one more. Yeah.
I'm Fadla from Muslim Aid. I'd just like to ask somebody in the panel about this sort of regional, for example, in Bangladesh, you had a reduction to 20%, but in some areas of Bangladesh, like Teknaf, it was 70%, or in Maheshkhali, it was 60%, or Ukhia, it was 68%. So you had a good picture overall for the country, but you have pockets of poverty. And I was very impressed with BRAC's study of the ultra-poor, because they tend to be left out of social networks, they tend to be left out of even self-help networks within the village structure, they're left out. So has any of the group done a study on these excluded groups? And the gendered analysis is really important, because very often we tend to neglect the gender analysis in this study of poverty. So I'd like to ask any members of the group if they could elaborate on those.
Okay. I think we'll take those three questions and then revert back for more afterwards. Excuse me, from BRAC, was the question to someone in specific or to the panel in general? Yeah, okay, sorry. So I guess maybe you, Albel, want to first, do you have experience where NGOs and civil society have been working together to sort of form coalition and address things jointly to reduce poverty in the case of Ethiopia, and maybe there are other experiences here?
Yeah, okay, I think this is a very important question. Let me just briefly go through how in Ethiopia development plans are formulated. Now, the government has 5 years plan, including the PRCP, SDPRP, Growth and Transformation Plan. When they formulate the plan, it is open before the approval, it's open for debate in every segment of society. Women groups, they can debate on that, and the rural people can debate on that, and the professional associations, civic society like the Economic Association, like the Civil Society, NGO, CRD, Christian Relief Development, these are discussed on each plan. And also the donor groups also discuss on the government plan. Then at the end of the day, this come together and finally approved by the parliament. So one means of accommodating the views of the people, including those discriminated or including those the minority, are captured through this. And it's always participatory in that way. So this is a brief answer for this. I think in terms of excluding groups in Ethiopia, the basic objective is broad-based development, meaning the benefits that obtained from growth should benefit the majority of the people. In a way, that's why it is poor oriented growth. When, in brief, I think maybe we can discuss later here. First, when the government addresses the problems of the poor, the first question ask who is poor in the country? Who are the people? The rural people. The rural people are the majority of 85% of the people are in the rural area. So it should be broad-based, the development. When you make it, how do you make it broad-based? What do these people have on hand? They have land, they have labor, their own labor. So you have to make it participatory. If you are going to be participatory, then you have to consult these people starting from the plan, designing of the program. This is the way how the government is working.
Great, thank you. Andrea, do you have some experiences to share from Ecuador?
Well, like I was saying, I think that in Ecuador, the role of civil society is very much political and not so strong in the delivery of services first. So it's a worthy distinction, and so I think that is the role that they have played. And when the Constitution came around, it was an opportunity for them to put forward some of the ideas that had been boiling before within civil society organizations, within indigenous movements, and put them in the Constitution. So I don't know if we have a lot of experience in terms of implementing policies or programs that have collaboration between civil society organizations and government or other like concrete aspects like that. But I think that the case shows the importance, at least, of this collaboration at the political level. And then in terms of the question, can I do the question?
Yeah, of course.
on discrimination and specific communities. Ecuador is a very diverse country within indigenous communities and nationalities, and it's a plurinational state. So from the government perspective, the way of tackling the inequality and the discrimination has been through this territorial approach, so that they do give priority to areas that before did not have attention. So that means the central government having offices and having presence at the local level in communities that before had no attention. So that is a very concrete form of tackling the issue of reaching to those that were before left behind. However, the biggest challenge is on these of the perception of what poverty is and what development is for indigenous communities and the rest of the country and the government plans. So the government has planned, for example, for a very extensive and centralized vision of education. But before, there were a lot of bilingual education schools and a system to foster also the education of indigenous people, and that one now is not being promoted, for example, because it was thought of that it didn't have the sufficient quality of the education that the country needs. But then it's this challenge. It still shows a confrontation between the model of development that is imposed and planned from within the central government and what are the perceptions of the indigenous communities. There are indigenous communities that say, we might as well not have all these services, but we don't want oil companies. And then the oil companies are the ones paying the high revenues to pay for the resources. So it's a complicated issue, I think, and it stays at the level of these conflicting principles between the what development is for the indigenous communities and what development is for the government and the plan stated from the capital.
Great, thank you. And Andrew, your work, what are sort of the key findings and key takeaways, maybe especially with regards to the last two issues of the ultra poor and the sort of excluded and discriminated groups?
Well, I suppose all our work is focused on the ultra poor. I mean, we talk about people who are either chronically poor or who are severely poor, so some way under the poverty line, and that's the work that those are the groups that we focus on particularly. Just in terms of the issue of pockets of poverty, which I think is something that you find in probably all countries. Some countries perhaps are slightly luckier in some ways. They're able to get services to people more easily. Maybe Rwanda, Cambodia, in our group of countries, fewer difficulties. But I think a lot of it relates to government strategy. And if your government has a strategy to bring investment to particular areas, for whatever reason, whether it's because those areas have resources or for political reasons, then you're likely to be left with pockets of poverty. I think this is one of the points about structural transformation, that governments or regimes with an agenda of structural transformation are likely to want to universalize the services, the infrastructure that they invest in. And that has tremendous benefits and means that there will be fewer pockets of poverty. So, I mean, that's just an off-the-cuff response. It's, I think, probably entirely inadequate. But on gender, if you look in this unreadable table that we have here, I think the last point, as usual, is on progressive policies leading to reduce gender inequality. I mean, Chiara Mariotti, who has been doing this work with me, may have other things to say, but my observation is that many countries in our group, and of course more widely, have got good legislation, strong women's movements that have been promoting gender inequality, and so on. But when it comes to the role that these measures have played in reducing the poverty of the poorest households, the feedback that we get from looking at the literature is that the social norms that are prevalent in local societies make it very difficult for the legislation and the movements to have an impact. So in a way, looking across the boxes on that line, it's quite a disappointing picture, and it seems to me that this is very much a challenging area. In many cases, the poorest households are headed by women. I mean, that's not a generalization that you can make, but in certain countries that does come out, and there are usually historical reasons for that, historical social reasons for that. So it's a really important issue, and I think it's one of those policy issues which really, despite all the talk and the global commitment and the national commitments and so on, is a really tough one. On discrimination, thank you, Helen, for bringing that up in this context, because we have another stream of work on evaluating anti-discrimination measures with respect to poverty reduction. And I think we need to bring these two streams of work together. Somehow the discrimination issues have slipped off the table that we circulated. They are supposed to be there. I'm not quite sure why they're not there. Maybe they're implicit. But I mean, I think that countries like Ecuador actually have done so much, and in a way, there's a very positive link between the work of civil society and the work of the political regime. I mean, yes, there are tensions and difficulties, but if you look back over history, many of the anti-discrimination measures have been introduced precisely because of that, I don't know, synergy or good relationship, at least over certain periods of time. But it's a really important issue, and it's a particularly important issue when it comes to the labour market and how discriminated against groups figure in the labour market, as well as, you know, services and so on. So I think bringing these two streams of work together is something we must do.
Great, thank you. And Chris?
Yeah,
Please.
so I might just zoom out and discuss like the idea of like sort of how pro-poor growth relates to the fact that there are excluded groups and pockets of poverty. I guess what I'd say as a bare minimum is that if you're not getting pro-poor growth in your country, chances are that the pockets of poverty and excluded groups are even greater. So to some extent, I'd say that pro-poor growth should be considered an absolute bare minimum to have any chance of actually addressing these issues of sort of excluded groups, pockets of poverty, discrimination. And I just want to pick on a particular sort of country example that comes out in one of our papers here. So one of the countries that has had the most anti-pro-poor growth over the last 30 years is actually China. Whereby growth has been really skewed towards the top end of the distribution. And what we actually show is that if growth had been equal in China over the last 30 years, so just equal, not even pro-poor, just equal, extreme poverty would have been eliminated by 2010. And we know very well that there are excluded parts of the population who haven't gained from growth. And I think that's a really clear example in my mind where it's by pro-poor growth should be seen as the absolute minimum to be able to integrate excluded groups and pockets of poverty into the benefits of growth for the economy. So.
Great, thank you. I think Elizabeth had a question.
From here, ODI. I was wondering, Andrea, whether I'm really interested in this idea of the sort of the tension between, you know, the government had initially sort of the right intentions when Korea came in, and first of all in terms of inviting civil society and stakeholders to participate in the formulation of the constitution, but also kind of trying to deal, at least at the intended level, with dealing with this tension between sort of sustainable development and pro-poor development, and then what that means in different contexts. And you've talked a little bit about this, but I wonder if there's any more that you can say in terms of how it has been dealt with, what have been some of the tensions. Has there been any kind of an attempt to push back against oil companies or any other manifestations of sort of non-sustainable growth? And how is that dialogue? I mean, you made reference to the fact that relations between civil society and the government are now much colder than they used to be. What's been the trajectory of that dialogue? I just wonder if there's any lessons that can be learnt from that.
Thank you. My name is Tim Lancaster, ex-World Bank, ex-DFID. Pro-poor growth and development is clearly necessary and may be sufficient for dealing with poverty, poor people, but it's doubtful whether it can deal with extreme poverty for two reasons. First of all, there are excluded communities and those who are unable to participate in that development. But secondly, it may take too long, even if they can participate in development, to achieve levels of income that are above extreme poverty on any scale that is, on any time scale that is morally defensible. Getting services to the extreme poor, as Andrew suggested, is clearly necessary and can help. But I think that there has to be a focus too on cash safety nets. And I mean, we took the view in Britain and in other developed countries that 50 years ago, 70 years ago, that extreme poverty could only be erased if we had cash safety nets. Perhaps I'm not up with the literature, but maybe you, Espen or Andrew, could tell us to what extent there are comprehensive surveys of countries, to what extent there are cash safety nets in place. And it seems to me, although this is blue sky thinking, we ought to be thinking of universal safety nets, global safety nets, which donors might work up and negotiate with countries. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then take over there. No, then you can keep it.
Hello, thank you for your presentations. I wanted to ask a little bit about investing in rural irrigation infrastructure and how important that is to eliminating extreme poverty. Using the country of Ethiopia as an example, I think kind of poor rains this year and the El Nino effect are going to plunge a lot of people back into extreme poverty, or maybe households that haven't been in extreme poverty. Is it possible to actually eliminate extreme poverty sustainably in agriculturally dependent countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, without investing in irrigation infrastructure, even in cases where you have large social protection schemes like the PSNP program in Ethiopia?
Great, thanks. Let's do Dean. Let's take one more, Dean.
Thanks. My question is for Andrea. So I really enjoyed the presentation, and is very, very clear and nicely laid out. My interpretation of it, at least, was that you showed that there was impressive reductions in both monetary and non-monetary dimensions of poverty, and this was in the context of relatively modest economic growth, and then proposed three potential drivers of that, and the first one being macro policy, and then social protection and redistribution. And my reaction on the macro policy is that's such a untargeted instrument that it almost always functions through growth. And so as opposed to the redistribution, which makes perfect sense that it would help to reduce many of these dimensions of poverty, and could well do that in a context of no growth. And my question, so that's all a comment. My question to you is, does the analysis underlying the presentation allow you to come out and maybe take a little bit more risk and say, of these three, we really think it's so my prior is the redistribution that did this? Or is the evidence base just not there, and so that's why you're sort of being fairly cautious in offering all three explanations?
Great, thanks. So maybe Andrea, we start off with you. There were two questions specifically to you.
Okay. So first on this question on the sustainable development balance issue. So one of the structural problems that the country has is that of the weak political system within it, right? So we had, like I said, all these presidents that were not able to finish term because they were constantly struggling with opposition and without being able to collaborate and find agreements in the political arena. So this opened an opportunity for civil society because no candidate in 2006 would have, they needed coalitions to be able to win an election. Now, once Correa came into power, and then he's maintained such high levels of acceptance, above 50%, constantly throughout this almost 10 years, that has eroded the political system. And then now he has control power of the legislative, of the judiciary system, and of course of all the executive system. So in a way that has been also limiting the position and the possibility of civil society to keep moving their agenda forward, right? Because the government has maintained this plan of using revenue from the extractive sector to promote economic and social development. So the strategy has been to tackle only the economic aspect of the relationship with the mining and oil companies in trying to get better terms of the contracts, better deals from the contracts. They were renegotiated at one point so that they would have the government could take a bigger share of the revenue, but there were no strong change in the relationship of limiting their role. Even the national oil company became more important within the government. And then this was combined by the fact that the government in 2006, when this opportunity opened, they vouched to an initiative that had been promoted by the civil society of protecting one national park that has oil underneath it, which is the Yasuni National Park. And then they had different strategies to try to promote getting revenue from it internationally, but it eventually didn't work. And then the government decided that it will extract oil from this national park and a biodiversity hotspot. And then it was probably the breaking point between the relationships between many civil society organizations and the government, because they were not, the government was not fulfilling something that they had embarked themselves on as a national policy, and then they just left it back. So I think that the point is that the window of opportunity was there for civil society to push, but then because the political system itself has not been fixed and there is no political negotiation, then now there are no spaces to negotiate and for civil society to influence, because they're all taken by the government. So although it was like opened for a little bit, then it kind of shrank, and now they're like pushed away from the political decisions. Then on the question on the balance between the economic and the social aspects of the case, this was like with the authors, we were constantly coming back and forth about this one, and on the interviews we were trying to get as much as possible on this one, because it's the tough question. The first thing I'll say is that we saw that there's a distinct two periods. So between 2000 and 2006, growth had a very important role. And then from 2006 to 2012, redistribution had a very important role. It's hard to then put the whole picture together, because in 2000 to 2006, policies were about stabilization, controlling debt, no fiscal deficits. And then on the second section, it was more about redistribution. So I think that my take on it is that to a certain extent, for the government to put forward the distributive policies that it did, it needed some sort of economic order that was acquired in that first section. Was it the best way of doing it? Maybe not, but some sort of like having your accounts straight is probably a way to go before doing the redistributive policies. And so we do identify that those two different points, and it's hard to balance them out, to be honest.
Chris, do you want to go?
Yep. So I might just touch on the sort of two questions. So this idea of universal cash safety nets. I think that cash is the way to go, is the growing movement, like sort of Chris Blattman, for example, as I think termed himself like Mr. Cash. Like a lot of people are pushing this idea of just give cash to try and get people above the line. But what I might just point to, I feel like I'm plugging a lot of ODI work right now, but so there's an ODI paper called Financing the Future, where we actually zoom out and say, okay, based upon the typical costs in providing sort of cash transfers to people, the sort of targeting issues, the administration factors, and then if we look at sort of how far people are in poverty, how far below the sort of $1.25 or the now $1.90 a day line, how much would it cost to actually bring everyone in the world up? And so it's it's a little bit of a theoretical thing, because this obviously would be very hard to execute, but how much? Well, our estimates are in the order of 50 to 100 billion, which are well and truly below the amount of ODA in the world right now, let alone the amounts of money that are spent on a huge range of basic sort of social services everywhere. So, there definitely does seem to be a lot of scope in that, and I'd definitely recommend checking out that report. Just touching on this issue of sort of agricultural dependent countries and how they can deal with poverty. I'll direct you to the 0-0 report, which looks at zero poverty, zero emissions. One of the if I could have done another myth, one of the myths I would have wanted to break is this idea that there's some trade-off between addressing climate change and your economic growth rate or your economic development aspect to it. What this report shows is there's lots of actual synergies, easy wins that developing countries could be doing. Obviously, dealing with climate change is a global issue, but there's a lot of inefficiencies in the way how energy is currently used throughout the world. Actually, if there was a lot of savings done in terms of the irrigation systems, the way how energy is provided to large parts of the population, that could really actually boost the economic growth in a lot of countries. Things could become much more efficient, and also that could go further towards ending extreme poverty. So that's more zooming out from that question. So.
Thanks. Halibal, there was a specific question on Ethiopia. Maybe you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I think when it comes to the El Nino, I think the first to be affected are those in arid and semi-arid areas because the resource asset is very small. So it's good, rural irrigation is very important in terms of alleviating poverty. And then here, even if your program is mainly focusing on irrigation, small-scale irrigation in these areas, in some arid and arid areas. So whatever to the El Nino, if comes, if the water is not there, so it will be they will be affected. So the PSNEP program, I think if you look at it in detail in that program, it has two components. One is the protection component, where especially for those who are disabled and are not able to work and have no any family size that can produce, that can contribute. And it has also a work component where they link in terms of the aid into work, where people are contributing their labor in terms of generating the community asset, like reforestation, which in the long run, this can bring a sustainable build the natural asset of the people, and then irrigation comes because of the water generation. So I think combining these two, irrigation with safety net, and is I think important aspect, and it can also help for poverty reduction, because it's only the natural asset that they have. People, water, if they have water, they have the labor, and they have the land. So you combine these three, and then try to just contribute, participate them to alleviating this extreme poverty.
Thanks. Andrew?
Okay, thank you. I'll try and deal with a couple of issues. One is the extent to which countries have invested in social protection. I think this is still quite varied. I mean, if you go around the regions, typically Latin America, most Latin American countries have, in fact, I think probably all have cash transfer programs of one sort or another, mostly conditional cash transfers. If you go to East Asia, thinking of China plus Korea and so on, the successful countries there tended to go for social protection programs quite late in their trajectory of development. So they had invested early in infrastructure and education, and much later in health and social protection in terms of achieving coverage. If you go to Southeast Asia, it's a very recent picture for several of the countries. If you go to Africa, it's very mixed. There are countries like Ethiopia and Rwanda which have invested now for 10, 15 years quite deeply and have significant coverage, particularly of the poorest people. But you can go to other countries and there's nothing, and in between there's a whole range of situations there. So I think it's very varied. There's something called the Social Assistance Database, which you can go to and gives you a reasonably up-to-date picture of how many people are covered. As I remember, it's social assistance now, that is cash transfers and other related measures like public works programs, covers about 1 billion people, probably upwards of 1 billion people in developing countries. And the second one, this question about investing in infrastructure in an agriculture-dependent economy, and if you combine it with social protection, is that enough to eradicate poverty? I mean, I think there are some very rich countries which are still agriculture-dependent, but very few of them. New Zealand is the one that comes to mind. I mean, I doubt that many countries will be able to progress towards eradicating poverty, retaining a highly agriculture-dependent economy. It seems to me that diversification, both at a local level and probably in the long term at a macro level, are necessary. And Ethiopia has its agriculture-led industrialization, and most countries have policies, well, many countries have policies towards that sort of diversification. So, I mean, it's opinion, really, but I doubt it.
Great. Thanks. Maybe just to add to the question on cash transfers, since you also asked me about that, I think that's something that definitely from the bank side is very much on the rise, and Andrew sort of painted a bit of a picture, and it's true that it also, was very predominant first in Latin America, but in a recent report that the World Bank had on reviewing, I think it was probably based on the social assistance database that Andrew mentioned, there's now, just between 2010 and 2014, the number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa that had cash transfer went from 20 countries to 20 to 40 countries out of 48 sub-Saharan Africa countries. And from the early 2000s, there were very few. So this is very much on the rise and a very important tool, I think, for the World Bank and for governments in trying to reach the goal of ending extreme poverty. But your second question is also a very difficult one. How do we target this? Will it be universal or targeted towards the very extreme poor? And I'm not sure we have some sort of definite answers on what works best in that regard. There's not yet any online questions, I think. If there are any online viewers that have questions, please submit them now, and we will try to get your questions transmitted here. There's a question from the gentleman over there.
David Piershaw from LSE. Almost all the presentations, which is very interesting, but could be answers to questions: how can we eliminate poverty, or how can we get pro-poor growth, and fairly familiar discussion. I don't know whether the assumption is that extreme poverty, that eliminating extreme poverty just means exactly the same as eliminating poverty generally. But I mean, if you take certain examples of extreme poverty, that if one looks intra-household income distribution, that women in much of the world are not only experiencing sexual violence, having hours spent fetching water, but subjugated in poverty terms, and that's one example of extreme poverty. The results of disability and the effects of certain diseases may exacerbate a situation that is poverty stricken more generally, but produce extremes of poverty. Discrimination against certain groups in some societies may lead to extremes of poverty in a situation that's generally poor. But is it the assumption in tackling answering the question, how can we eliminate extreme poverty, that these are all too difficult, that these that if we just reduce poverty generally, that will be a good thing, and be a very good thing, and we can't consider any of the situations that cause, if you like, extremities of poverty. So I'm not very clear whether the discussion is about eliminating poverty or identifying extremes of poverty and the causes of that and what will tackle that, because all the emphasis so far seems to be not moving on from how we eliminate poverty.
Great, thanks. Over here.
Hi, my name is Alicia. I'm a graduate student at King's College. I don't know if you guys have any experience with microfinance. I'm wondering what the role of microfinance is in pro-poor growth, like whether it's positive or negative. And do you feel that participation, or that with the microfinance groups, does that prevent the government from investing in social policies and stuff?
Hi, my name is Seema. I'm a PhD student from SOAS. I have two questions. One is related to what she is saying. How do you think financial inclusion policies are related to or act as a complement to the social protection policies so that the results are more faster? So if we have financial inclusion policies together with social protection policies, we get results faster. That is my first question. And second is, for how long can we expect the government to feed the poor? So for say, by 2030, we are able to eliminate the extreme poverty in the world. Or so for say, in developing countries. So do we say that the state should stop spending in social protection policies? Won't that bring the poor who were out of poverty back into poverty? So that's what
Thank you for the presentation. I just have a question about, because it seems to me that all these policies have to be made by governments, national governments, but what in the case of national government doesn't function, for example, like in conflict-affected countries like Congo, for example, I'm thinking about it, it's just like, how can you attend from the government to set up this kind of pro-poverty reduction policies if the government is not working well? So, yeah, should it be a priority before this implementation, or can it happen together?
Great, thanks. Okay, maybe one last there. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, is this working?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. All those presentations, really, really interesting. I just wanted to go a little bit, since Andrea has the experience of the conditional cash transfers in Ecuador, it kind of linked to the previous point about how much those are targeted at reducing extreme poverty. I know that in Brazil, the flagship program there was, such minimal amounts that were being transferred. It wasn't really concentrating on at least headcount the amount wasn't going to be enough to lift people out of poverty, but the aim of the program was much more focused on kind of poverty of opportunities or inequality of opportunities and reducing that. So maybe Andrea could comment on what the actual aim of the program was there and how much it was targeted at the extreme poor versus the poor, and thinking much more long-term or more about poverty in its basic sense. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Some excellent questions. Anyone want to start? The definition of poverty, extreme poverty versus poverty. Chris?
Yep. I hope, are you going to come to the next session? Yeah. Fantastic. Well, I suggest ask that question at the next session. Being a bit cheeky there, but when we are talking about extreme poverty here, we're really coming at it from an income lens, and extreme poverty is defined as living on or living below $1.90 in 2011 PPP. So that's kind of like a very specific definition, whereas what you're referring to are many more aspects of poverty that are very important, and hopefully sort of will come out in the World Bank Global Commission on Poverty sort of discussions now, where they're talking about sort of how do we broaden the concept of poverty to include these aspects. So definitely raise that in the next session. So just one thing I really want to touch on, I think this touches on the sort of financial inclusion aspect and the sort of longevity of longevity of social protection. So one thing about these sort of growth incidence curves, so that's sort of what we're showing in terms of where the growth has been distributed across the distribution, is that they're very sensitive to time. So we've shown you the general trend, but so from one year to the next, it can vary greatly. And what this illustrates is that particularly among those people towards the bottom end of the distribution, there is this issue of consumption smoothing. And I think that, that does highlight, at least to me, when you look at it sort of like year on year or maybe every couple of years when surveys are available, it does make you realise that things can vary a lot from year to year. And the more sort of opportunities there are for poor to be able to consumption smooth, whether that be informally or formally, I think that's a different discussion. But definitely I think sort of we're trying to show you broad general trends, but things can change dramatically year on year. So I think that would be a good reason to think that there's a good role for sort of some stability for sort of consumption over a long period of time. But anyway, I'll leave it to others for the rest.
Let me final. I think it's interesting. The government to feed the poor. I think this is a misconception. I think the government can't feed the poor, and no one can feed the poor. The poor feed themselves. The thing is how let's help them to feed themselves in terms of policy, in terms of implementation, in terms of the poor have their own resources, but they can't mobilize that resources. Our policies, our support should facilitate this, how these people feed themselves. I think that's the best. Thank you.
Andrew?
Okay, thank you. I mean, David, the issues that you raise, I think, are very valid. I mean, there are countries that have attempted to address these forms of discrimination, and their experience is varied in terms of how that translates through into helping people to escape poverty or at least experience a better life. And there are lots of things between the policy and the outcome, but there are also countries which don't actually deal with those issues at a policy level. So there's quite a variety, and there's a lot of learning that you can do from the countries which have attempted to do that. We did some work on this last year, if you're interested. It's a report on strengthening social justice and looking at intersecting inequalities and how different countries have addressed the intersecting inequalities. So you might be a poor woman, but also disabled and living in a remote region or belonging to a minority ethnic group. So you can have multiple disadvantages which you have to address. And we were trying to look for governments that had, in some way or another, addressed those issues. And we came up with a group of countries which really had tried to address those issues. And I think the results, Ecuador was one of them, and Ethiopia was another. And the results were varied in terms of poverty reduction, but it should very much feature strongly in the discourse over the next few years. Secondly, on financial inclusion, I think this is a very good question. You can go to our website, the Chronic Poverty Advisory Network website, and you'll find a policy guide on financial inclusion, which argues that if you want to include the poorest people, you need to focus on savings and savings groups. You need to focus on insurance, and you need to focus on linking with social protection. So I think you're kind of going down the right route. However, linking financial inclusion, financial services with social protection is not a straightforward business, because they're two very different kinds of activity, and the agencies undertaking both of them have very different rhythms and priorities and so on. So actually bringing them together in practice is quite a big challenge. But definitely for the poorest people, credit is not, generally speaking, the top priority, and that's a message that I always take an opportunity to try and get over. The third point is about how long do governments need to carry on with feeding the poor, as you put it. I mean, in the social protection field, there is a massive discussion now about graduation. And so agencies and governments, like the Ethiopian government and many others, are concerned about this question, and they want to see people coming out of social assistance programs, cash transfer programs. I think if you think about the poorest people and the most discriminated against people and so on, probably you could say, as a rule of thumb, that they will need to spend longer in those programs, that the transfers would need to be bigger, and that there should possibly be an asset component in that transfer, particularly if you're expecting people to move on to self-employment. I think the other point to make here is that, yes, we're talking about getting people out of poverty, but as has been mentioned in several other contributions, people also fall into poverty. And that process is going to continue. So there's another issue which I think has not really been dealt with yet in the social protection policy field, which is when do developing countries which have invested in cash transfers, social assistance, when do they begin to step up also on social insurance, which is more capable of preventing people falling, whether it's health insurance or unemployment insurance. Unemployment insurance is usually the last thing that countries invest in. But other forms of insurance which prevent people falling into poverty because of the risks that they habitually face. And I think that's a very big discussion, and I don't know of anybody who has answered that question. How rich does a country have to be before it seriously invests in getting coverage on social insurance? Most countries have limited social insurance programs in the formal sector, in the government, in the bureau for civil servants, and for limited numbers of private sector companies. There's a very big issue there about preventing people sliding back into poverty. So you might escape and then you slide back again. There's a social assistance program, fine, but it doesn't actually prevent you from sliding back.
Yeah.
Okay. First, on the question of extreme poverty, when we were drafting the report, we kept coming back to this question, and then to connect it later to the next panel, I think it came a lot about, for us, on data. It was very difficult for us to disaggregate the impact of policies from the poor, from the extremely poor. It was very difficult. For example, in terms of jobs, what made the difference? What were available for the poor or the extremely poor? It was very difficult to make that distinction. So in many ways, we had limited capacity to do that. Having said that, Ecuador does have some policies that would be interested to explore more, but there is no evidence on them yet. So we have a cash transfer program for people with disabilities and for people who take care of others who have disabilities. And there's now a new reform on social security law for allowing women who received a cash transfer program to start participating in the social security system. So it's there are things that are trying to be done which could be interesting to see how they really impact the extreme poverty. But until now, we just had very, very little to really evidence for us to say strongly beyond poverty and into extreme poverty. On the question on microfinance, there are some. In Ecuador, there's this focus on the popular and social economy, is what they call it, from the government. And one of the papers we reviewed for our case study suggested that one of the problems that a policy focused on microfinance could have in a country like Ecuador, like a middle-income country already, is that it might be pushing for informality. So it might be pushing for businesses to stay small and for smaller kind of endeavors instead of bigger ones. So the government is trying to change it to see if microfinance could move into financing more joint projects. So not just one little shop, let's say, but a bigger investment by a community, or trying to shift that so that it doesn't stay in informal, low productivity activities, which is the challenge that was seen in the case of microfinance. And then the question specifically on the conditional cash transfer program in Ecuador. It's a program that is not really conditional. It is on paper, but there are no practical ways of following if households comply with the rules of children attending school and healthcare. It is $50 per household per month. So it's a good amount of money that was increased in the last years. And the government has been going through the process of what Andrew was mentioning of graduating like households from receiving the cash transfer, and the government has been trying to think what is kind of like the package of additional services that the household receives if it graduates. So it's not very clear, but the idea is that if the household doesn't receive the cash transfer anymore, they can have, for example, a support visit for healthcare, and they enter into a different track, kind of. But it's difficult now that the economy is going down, and then it's uncertain how well the government will be able to handle this shock, and will they be able to cover again under the program to people who may be falling back into poverty, given that it's not planned that way. So the conditional cash transfer program was not planned as an insurance scheme, and that is what it's kind of needed now. So it'll be interesting to see if it will be able to do the job. So based on this reflection, and then the extensive problems that the program has had on targeting, I think that it's very difficult to target well. So I think that it's better to go with a broader kind of program it's more likely to cover the extremely poor than if you focus it more. I don't think that will really help a program be more effective in tackling extreme poverty.
Thank you, Andrea. And with that, we're out of time. Thank you very much to all the panelists and to the audience for excellent comments and questions. I think we go for lunch, is that right?
Thank you, and thank you, Espen, as well, for chairing.